Hi, my name is Doris Jeanne MacKinnon, and I'm very pleased to share a little bit about my latest book, The Premier and His Grandmother. So the inspiration for this book came from one of my earlier books about a Métis woman named Isabella Clark Hardesty Lougheed. And oftentimes when I'd be sharing about that book, I would find that people were not aware that Peter Lougheed, our former Premier of Alberta, had an Indigenous grandmother. So I thought that this was part of his history that was worthy of exploration. So I'm going to share just a short excerpt. Anyway, here we go. There was indeed a place for the Métis in the new economy, and it was often the connections that the Métis had forged during the fur trade that enabled their successful transition and their roles as the nucleus of many of the early pioneer Western communities. When Peter Lougheed referred to his grandfather James Lougheed as one of Alberta's early pioneers who contributed to the establishment of that province, the implicit reference must also be to Peter's Métis ancestors, who were those first pioneers with whom his grandfather forged important connections. Indeed, James Lougheed had himself confirmed that when he came west, he became a company man by way of his marriage to a Métis daughter of the fur trade, Isabella Clark Hardesty Lougheed. James Lougheed certainly knew that he was making a connection to an important Métis fur trade family when he married Isabella Clark Hardesty. When James and Isabella married in 1884 in the pioneer prairie community that would eventually become the city of Calgary, marriages between Métis women and Euro-Canadian men were still common practice, as they had been during the height of the fur trade. As the young couple settled into their new home, there were very few current-day amenities, so reliance on the Métis fur trade culture and kin networks would continue to be critical and of benefit. However, as more settlers arrived from Eastern Canada and Europe, ethnic boundaries solidified. A woman of Isabella's status would have been astute enough to know that cultivating a public persona as a Euro-Canadian lady was key to maintaining the status that she had enjoyed as a daughter of fur trade aristocracy. There is no way to know to what extent Isabella's public persona permeated her private persona, so there is no way to know how much awareness her own children had of their Métis ancestry and history. In the same way, in the case of Isabella's grandson Peter Lougheed, there is no way to determine with absolute certainty how much exposure he had to the Métis history and culture of his grandmother. Whether he knew much or little of his grandmother's Métis identity and history, there is certainly some indication that Peter Lougheed did not deny that Indigenous ancestry when he served as Premier of Alberta. In fact, there is some evidence that he sought to learn more about his grandmother's personal history and identity. This was the case even though the matter of Indigenous history was only beginning to be an area of study in the 1970s when Peter Lougheed entered public office, and it was prior to the acceptance of oral history as a method of expanding our collective understanding. Indeed, when Peter Lougheed served as Premier of Alberta, the matter of truth and reconciliation as we understand it today in regard to Indigenous peoples was not something that would have been considered by politicians, educators, or the majority of the general public. There are some who speculate that by the time Peter Lougheed left political office in 1985, he had become more determined to learn about his Indigenous ancestry. It is the case that Peter devoted much time and effort to the restoration of Lady Isabella and Sir James's grand home, now Lougheed House. The history of Beaulieu Lougheed House confirms that the communities of the West were always more diverse than the history books acknowledged. In the words of Peter Lougheed, a good history education will reveal that the historical narratives we grew up with are dynamic, multidimensional, and always open to being recast and re-examined in the context of the present. Canada's history, our collective memory, must reflect the diversity of our past and of our present. Indeed, it is the nature of historical narrative that it must be revisited from the context of today, all the while recognizing that historical characters are always people of their times. Thank you for joining me today for this short excerpt from my new book, and I hope, if you choose to read it, that you will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it. Thank you so much.